Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Ryan Bijan, host of COWTOWN Movie Classics, and we are closing out our Hagsploitation horror series in January with a very funny, very entertaining, very bizarre example from Hammer Films. From 1965, it's the film FANATIC, starring the notorious Tallulah Bankhead. This film, probably best known in the United States as Die, Die, My Darling. And tonight's special guest, he is a prolific author, film historian. He's written the books English Gothic, A Century of Horror Cinema, followed it up with American Gothic and Euro Gothic, and I understand a fourth volume is in the works. He's certainly one of the top film historians in the field, and he's an occasional actor, and we might bring that around later. So joining us tonight is our very special guest, Mr. Jonathan Rigby. How are you doing tonight, Jonathan?
I'm doing very well, Ryan. Very well indeed.
FANATIC, of course, we're doing this theme based on, we know it as the Hagsploitation film. It goes by many other titles, the Psycho Biddy genre, Granny Guignol, which is one that you mentioned earlier, which is quite funny. How do you define this genre? How do you classify it?
Well, as we know, it sort of suddenly burst forth in 1962 with Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, although there had been a very important progenitor in 1950 called Sunset Boulevard. And yes, I think it was Castle of Frankenstein magazine. It was certainly one of those mid-60s monster magazines that sort of coined the phrase hag horror. And I think just right there in the phrase hag horror, you've got the fact that certainly to modernize it, it's a problematic genre, and it's problematic. I mean, I think if you started off, properly speaking, with Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, the second hag horror film was Lady in a Cage, which was made a few months later. And Olivia de Havilland was the star of that. And Olivia de Havilland was 46. And I think you've got an inbuilt kind of problem there, in that, is a woman of 46 a hag? There's a kind of prurient quality. Basically, the genre was built on the prurient interest in seeing former glamour stars generally in their 50s, which to me isn't even that old either, but generally in their 50s. And there's a prurient interest in seeing them in these rather lurid scenarios, and seeing them, sort of dressed down and looking, older,
Yeah.
A film like Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, it's clearly a horror film, but there's not actually much horror in it. And
Hmm.
I think that the horror you're being invited to relish in a film like that is the horror of the fact that these women have got old. There's a touch of misogyny in the whole concept. But you see, this is the double-edged sword. They did give great, meaty, melodramatic roles to older actresses, and that's no bad thing, particularly when they're on the order of Betty Davis or Joan Crawford, or in tonight's film, Tallulah Bankhead. I mean, it's a feast, a thespian feast for those of us who like our acting, sort of red raw, if you like.
Yeah.
So yes, it's a double-edged sword. It's a genre I find a little bit tricky. I particularly don't like the phrase hagsploitation, but because I dispute the fact that these women were hags. It's a terrible, judgmental, pejorative kind of name. But their films themselves are often very, very, very interesting. And tonight's example is one of those. It is a very interesting film.
Oh, certainly. Now, Tallulah Bankhead, if you're a film buff, if you love classic movies, you're certainly familiar with the name. She's probably best known by today's audiences for her starring role in Alfred Hitchcock's film Lifeboat in
Yeah.
1944. Certainly a powerhouse performance. There's no reason she couldn't have had the career Betty Davis had, certainly in the 1930s or 40s. But if you actually look at her filmography, she did not make that many movies, at least compared to your Betty Davises or your Joan Crawfords. Why was that?
Well, I think largely it's because she preferred the stage. I think she had an enormously successful career on Broadway and in the West End of London, of course, as well. And she also became a notorious figure. And I think this particular film, Fanatic, when it was being made, it was made in September 1964. So when it was being made, the publicists emphasized the fact that Tallulah Bankhead preceded Beatlemania by 40 years. In other words, way back in the 20s, she'd been this incredible cult figure, a very racy figure,
Yeah.
who was really quite scandalous. And of course, she reveled in all that. But she seemed somewhat indifferent to films, rather. The stage was her métier, I guess. And by the time of this film, she frankly admitted, that she needed the money, darling. She was famous, of course, for saying darling, hence the American title of this film, Die, Die, My Darling. Watch out for it, by the way, because there is actually some reason for calling it that, not just for a little Tallulah Bankhead joke, because she does actually say that in the film.
She
So
says the title in the film.
she does.
And I think I probably prefer that title, and I don't know if I'm biased as an American, but Fanatic, it seems a little more generic. You don't quite know what it does apply to the film, but you don't quite, it could be about anything really with that title.
Well, Fanatic, yeah, I mean, Fanatic is the British title, and it's a British film essentially. So I think Hammer in the early 60s diversified a bit by making a whole bunch of psychological suspense thrillers. They were
Mhm.
often called mini Hitchcocks, although they didn't really owe that much to Psycho, more to that famous French film Les Diaboliques.
Yes.
And they were always made in black and white, and they often had these very staccato titles: Nightmare, Maniac, Paranoiac, for instance. That all these preceded Fanatic. So Fanatic really was very much in that vein. But the difference with Fanatic actually was it was the first of these films that they made in color. So
Yeah.
it has a very different sort of feel and tone to the other suspense thrillers. They're very sort of inky and very very black and white. They're very monochrome, but in a very creepy, very brilliantly creepy way. This film goes a different route and is really quite garishly coloured. So it's a bit more like the Hammer Gothic style mixed with their psychological suspense thriller style,
Yeah.
which is just one more aspect in which the film is very interesting.
Yeah. Well, no, I'm glad you brought up the mini Hitchcocks or the mini Clouseaus because of the Diabolique. Yes, inspiration. But no, you're right. The to me the beautiful kind of stylized Technicolor photography. This sets this movie apart not only from those, but most of the Hagsploitation films. Because even Baby Jane, it's made in the early '60s. That's a black and white film. Lady in a Cage, also black and white film. So I think this movie stands out on multiple levels.
Yeah, it was the first of Hammer's psychological thrillers to be in color, and it was also the first exploitation film to be made in color. You're quite right. Yeah, it was.
And of course, the film would open doors to other similar Hagsploitation films in the years to come for Hammer films, but we can talk about that after the movie.
We can talk about that after the movie. Yeah, yeah.
Well, Jonathan, thank you so much. If you're in the audience, please stick around after the film so you can hear the rest of our conversation. From 1965, Fanatic. That film's certainly a lot of fun, and you can definitely see the influence of Sunset Boulevard on this movie only 15 years later.
Yes, I think of the certainly these early hag horror films, this is the one that is closest to the kind of text. There's a fancy phrase, the text of these films, which is Sunset Boulevard. And the reason it's the closest is because they've got Tallulah Bankhead and they cast her as an ex-actress. And for reasons we don't quite understand, she's an ex-actress who has rejected her decadent past to such a degree that she's become, well, frankly, she's a religious maniac, isn't she? She's a fanatic, to use the British
Yeah.
title. But because of this change that they made to the original novel, which we'll talk about a little later, because of this change, they were able at the end to go into her inner sanctum where she's actually preserved. It's one of the most fascinating parts of the film, where she's preserved all these relics of her past. And of course, these relics are all Tallulah Bankhead relics, which of course connects you straight back to Gloria Swanson playing Norma Desmond in Sunset Boulevard. As a matter of fact, Tallulah Bankhead, who was apparently extremely difficult to deal with on this film, but one of the most difficult moments was when she entered that set for the first time and saw that the production designer, Peter Proud, had indeed done the Gloria Swanson thing and made it a sort of shrine to Tallulah Bankhead. And she was absolutely livid, apparently. Initially, they had to talk her around and convince her of the importance of all this memorabilia. But initially, she was appalled, I believe. Yes, she wasn't very easy on the film. In fact, the director, Silvio Narizzano, who was a Canadian, I've got a little quote from him here. He said, straight after it finished shooting, he said, "No words can express my relief that the picture's over.
Oh
She
my
is magnificent, but impossible."
Yeah.
So there you are. Um, yeah, it is in that regard, it is the closest to Sunset Boulevard. But the funny thing is, Hammer imposed that on the story because initially it was adapted from a novel by Anne Blaisdell called Nightmare. Now, Hammer couldn't use that title Nightmare because they'd already used it for one of one of their other psychological suspense thrillers. So they went with Fanatic. But Richard Matheson is a very distinguished American writer. Richard Matheson's screenplay was closely based on the book, apparently, in which the character is not an actress; it's just an old lady from Wales, and Richard Matheson adapted it quite faithfully. But then Hammer imposed the actress thing, presumably to remind you of Sunset Boulevard, but also, to link into the whole Tallulah Bankhead aspect. Um, Maybe it causes a few anomalies in the film. I don't know if it ever occurred to you when you see scenes in the village, the nearby village, which by the way is a beautiful village handy for Elstree Studios called Letchmore Heath, which you may remember from a famous film made a few years before this called Village of the Damned, in which
Yes.
all sorts
Yes.
of villagers are lying unconscious on the pavements and on the tarmac. That's Letchmore Heath. Um, anyway, when we go into Letchmore Heath and we meet the villagers, none of them seem to be aware that Mrs. Trefoil used to be an actress. They don't talk about her as a former celebrity. They just talk about her as the nutty lady up in the big house on the hill. That stuff. That the fact that she was a celebrity and was an actress is alluded to by nobody, except by Mrs. Trefoil's scrapbook, which we see quite early on, and of course at the end by her inner sanctum. So I'm not sure the transplant was fully integrated, if you like. But generally, if you're watching the film just once through, you may not notice that.
Hmm. Well, to be
Anyway,
fair, maybe she went under a different stage name back in the day, and the village didn't make a connection. But
oh, but Trefoil is such a marvelous name. Why
it
would,
is. That's true.
why
That's
would you lose Trefoil? Anyway,
maybe she changed her name to Tallulah Bankhead. That was her professional stage name.
that was it. That
There you
was
go.
it. Anyway, it's one of the things that's always fascinated me about it, and is the fact that it's basically the first four chapters of Dracula. Um, because the Stefanie Powers character is Jonathan Harker. She gets imprisoned in Castle Dracula. There are no mirrors, which is exactly like Castle Dracula. She tries to smuggle letters out from high windows. It's not difficult gypsies down in the courtyard. It's Donald Sutherland making a complete mess of things. And there are all these details that are just straight out of Dracula. And I often look upon Mrs. Trefoil as being a kind of combo of Dracula and Mrs. Bates from Psycho. Do you know, I often think that Sunset Boulevard is obviously a big starting off point for these films, but I think Psycho was as well, because Psycho is I mean, Mrs. Bates, of course, in Psycho is dead
Hmm.
and looks very much dead in that fruit cellar. But I think part, maybe unconsciously, part of the impulse behind these films is to get Mrs. Bates on screen and put flesh on her and bring her back to life. And that's very much the vibe I get from Whatever Happened to Baby Jane.
Hmm.
Joan Crawford and Betty Davis in their different ways are playing Mrs. Bates. So with Mrs. Trefoil, you get Mrs. Bates and Dracula. And there's also a rather elementary turnaround, isn't there? She has a shrine as well as to her old self. She has a shrine to her son, of course.
Hmm.
But her son isn't down in the cellar in a state of preservation, sitting in a rocking chair. That would be too much like Psycho. It's just a portrait. It would be left to later filmmakers to rip off Psycho quite that directly, and it would happen. But in Fanatic, it's just a portrait of the son. So, you know, Sunset Boulevard is the progenitor of these films, but I think Psycho is too, in a funny sort of way.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. I can certainly see the connection there. So I know Tallulah Bankhead was a bit of a nightmare to work with. Was it worth it in the end? What was the reception like for the film?
Well, it didn't. I don't think it did her personally any good. I mean, she got to stay at the Ritz Hotel in Mayfair again, which she hadn't been in for 30 years or so, and she got a nice paycheck. But she died only 4 years later. I think she's 62 when she made this film, and she died only 4 years later. And in fact, it was her last film. I think she did a few bits and bobs of TV
Mhm.
afterwards. Wasn't she in Batman, I think,
I think
after
so,
this?
yeah. Yeah.
But this was her last. As you said in the introduction, she didn't make many films, and this was the last one. So I don't think it really did her any good other than to top up the coffers,
Mhm.
which
But for
apparently was quite important at the time.
yeah, but for Hammer films, did it do well at the box office or critically? Did it get any good reception at the time?
It was quite well received, actually. It got some very nice reviews. It was released in the UK anyway, with The Killers,
Mhm.
um, and I think the that little double bill did very well.
Mhm.
Um, it was conceived as a sort of mid-range Hammer film of the period. Um, it differs from the previous psychological thrillers, as we said, in that it's in color. And curiously enough, the cinematographer Arthur Ibbotson, it was his one and only Hammer film.
Oh, wow.
And particularly at the end there in Mrs. Trefoil's basement, you do wonder if he's seen some Mario Bava films because there's some beautiful lilacs and greens and reds. It's all quite irrational, the lighting down there. Oh, and it also applies to that sort of little outhouse in which Peter Vaughan gets shot in the head and
Mhm.
ends up in the sink with the
Yeah.
kitchen tap dripping on him. That outhouse kind of thing. That also is lit in a very strange, lurid green, and I think the reason, of course, is because a nasty, horrible thing happens there. It's a film that takes its time, allowing anything nasty and horrible to happen. But when it does, the cinematographer Arthur Ibbotson kicks in with these lurid colours, and it's lovely stuff. It's also I mentioned the production designer Peter Proud. I was watching it, and she's Mrs. Trefoil is sitting on a kind of what looks like a kind of jetty. The River Thames is directly outside her house, and you can hear a kind of frog chorus in the background, and she's sitting in a rattan armchair. And I think, gosh, this is very Tennessee Williams almost, isn't it? Kind of
Yeah.
Southern Gothic. And in point of fact, what do you know? Peter Proud, the production designer, said exactly that at the time. We're aiming for a kind of Tennessee Williams feel. There's a Tennessee Williams feel in Hertfordshire, in the home counties in Britain. It's a strange kind of transplant, but that's what they were aiming for. Obviously, I guess in deference to the fact that, of course, Tallulah Bankhead was American. They'd imported her from the USA.
Hmm. And no, it's interesting. It's funny you bring up Tennessee Williams actually, because if you look at a lot of his plays and stories, there is sort of a proto Hagsploitation feel to a lot of them. You have older
Yeah.
women,
Oh, absolutely. Well, of
often
course.
predatory women.
Yes. Well, of course. Catherine Hepburn in 1959, was in the UK to make Suddenly Last Summer.
Yes, yeah.
And yeah, there's an undercurrent of horror there, and in quite a lot of Tennessee Williams, you're right? Well, I mean, look at Blanche Dubois. I mean, you could relate her to Norma Desmond, for example, from Sunset Boulevard. So yeah, that was quite an interesting little connection for Peter Proud to make, and it does come through in the film, and yet the film is, as Hammer films tend to be, is totally and invincibly British. As we've discussed, Letchmore Heath, a beautiful village, but and Letchmore Heath is populated by lovely character actors like Robert Dorning. He plays the publican, and Diana King is the talkative lady outside the shop. And who's the other one who particularly struck me? Oh yes, of course, Henry McGee. Anybody who's familiar with Benny Hill, Henry McGee plays the rector, about whom Mrs. Trefoil complains bitterly because he's not a true man of God. But the rector is played very briefly by Henry McGee, and of course, any Benny Hill fan will be a huge fan of Henry McGee.
After the success of Fanatic, this was not Hammer's last contribution to the subgenre.
It wasn't. It wasn't. Hammer were very involved with Seven Arts at the time, which was run by Kenneth Hyman and Elliot Hyman, and they had been involved with Hammer going way back to the Curse of Frankenstein, actually, in one way or another. And of course, it was Seven Arts who, in fact, kicked off this whole subgenre because Seven Arts were behind Whatever Happened to Baby Jane.
Hmm.
So the fact that it was Seven Arts who brought the FANATIC subject to Hammer is, very, very appropriate. So what is the next appropriate step? Well, about 6 months after making FANATIC, Hammer bring Betty Davis over in, I think, April 1965. They got Betty Davis over to appear in The Nanny. Now they go back into black and white for that. And The Nanny is a great movie actually. And later on they'll bring her back for the anniversary. Talking of Hammer and Hag horror, one of the interesting things, another first for the Fanatic, was the fact that Fanatic marked a point at which Hag horror briefly moved to Britain, because you've got Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, you've got Lady in a Cage, Straight Jacket, which is a William Castle film with Joan Crawford, and then Hush, Hush, Sweet Charlotte, which is Betty Davis and Olivia de Havilland. Of course, originally Joan Crawford, but Betty Davis, by various connivances, got Joan Crawford removed from that film. So they had to start again with Olivia de Havilland. And at about the time they were starting again with Olivia de Havilland, that's when Fanatic starts shooting at Elstree. But with Fanatic, as I say, the subgenre becomes British temporarily, because you've got Fanatic followed by The Nanny, which we've discussed. Hammer also make a film with Joan Fontaine called The Witches.
Yes.
Then non-Hammer, Joan Crawford, of course. All these names keep coming up. Joan Crawford comes over to make a circus horror movie called Berserk. And then later on, she'll come over to do an extraordinary thing called Trog. But so there is this brief moment when the genre goes over to being British. But then I think in 1968, Robert Aldrich, who made Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, sort of reclaimed the genre by making Whatever Happened to Aunt Alice, which I think was made in Tucson, Arizona. So suddenly it's back to being American. But even when it was in Britain, the interesting thing is, I think the subgenre was always looked upon as intrinsically American, because even the British ones never use British actresses. I mean, I don't think American audiences might know people like Gracie Fields or Jessie Matthews. They might know Celia Johnson, but no British producer, intriguingly, thought, I know, we'll cast an aging star of yesteryear who's British. They never did that. It was always bring those aging actresses over from Hollywood. That was the important. I think it's something to do with faded Hollywood is very important to this subgenre. So even the British films use Hollywood actresses.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what that means, but it's a curious anomaly. But yes, so this was the beginning of a brief transplant of Hag horror to Britain. It wasn't going to last, although there'd actually be other examples into the 70s, very sporadically. But yes, it suddenly came over to Britain, and yeah, it's a Fanatic is. We shouldn't underestimate it. You'll have noticed what a small cast it's got,
Mm-hmm.
which Hammer will have been very happy about, because of course their heroine they also brought over from America, of course, Stefanie Powers, who wasn't quite 22 when making this film, and she's really good. She's
Oh yeah.
really good. She's really good in it. One thing about the film, actually, it takes Stefanie Powers a long time for the penny to drop as to the fact that this woman isn't just eccentric and rather objectionable. She's also barking mad. It takes quite a long for that penny to drop. And that's one of the artful features of the film, the fact that it takes quite a long time for us to realize that too. But when the penny does drop, the tone of the film kind of carries on a sort of black comedy sort of level. And to me, the film never gets quite as nasty as it's constantly threatening to get.
Mm-hmm.
Some quite nasty things happen in it, and one of the problems for me is the score by Wilfred Josephs, who was a great composer, and the music is great. But I don't, when the film flips halfway through into being more serious and grim, I don't think Wilfred Josephs got the memo, because as it were, because the music, there's lots of harpsichords and flutes and clarinets in it,
Yeah.
and it's quite jolly and light in many ways.
Yeah.
And to me, those skittering harpsichords slightly undercut the film. But people's mileage varies. A lot of people will like that, the fact that it keeps the film quite fluffy, despite the fact that nasty things are happening. but yes, the film never quite takes the gloves off, really, because let's face it, Mrs. Trefoil is an appalling character, and what she does is absolutely shocking,
Yeah,
reprehensible. But it's all kept quite light, which some people will like that a lot. I mean, I like the film, but I do think it has a few little problems. But then what film doesn't, you know?
that's true. Now, Jonathan, in addition to being a very prolific, established film critic, film historian, who's spent a lot of your life writing about these types of movies, as an actor, you've also gotten to dabble in this world a little bit. And
Oh
that,
yes, well, yes, I've been dabbling in this world. I mean, I wrote an adaptation of Dracula donkeys years ago, which was put on several times. Um, but yes, I know what you're talking about. You're talking about Lot Number 249, which was the ghost story for Christmas on BBC One over here, which I believe you can get on BritBox in the
yes,
USA.
that's how I
Um,
watched it.
that's how you watched it. Well, that was on here on Christmas Eve, and it was an adaptation of the Arthur Conan Doyle story Lot Number 249, and it was written and directed by Mark Gatiss, whom I've known for over 30 years, and we've been big horror fans all that time. And it's a nice gothic thing. And I played the kind of forelock tugging retainer at an Oxford college, kind of major domo who runs the college servant class. And I quite like it was a short part, which is I always find gratifying, short but quite nice and juicy. And it had a marvelous mummy in it, played by a young actor who's actually makes something of a speciality of monsters and grotesque characters, ghostly, spectral characters generally. A guy called James Swanton, who's very
Hmm.
brilliant. And the mummy in this, wonderful makeup by Lou and Dave Elsey. I'm good, aren't I? Getting all the credits across. The mummy is terrific. I think it's very short and sharp, sort of little gothic sort of feastette for Christmas. So yes,
Certainly,
that was great fun to do.
yeah, no, it was wonderful seeing you in it. Of course, if you're a big Hammer fan, if you're a classic Gothic fiction fan, or any of the old school horror films, certainly for me, there are so many great Easter eggs in the movie. A lot of little nods here and there, especially to the works of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, on whose story the film is based.
Yes, a certain famous character sort of comes in without being explicitly identified, but let's not go into that. We won't
Sure,
spoil it
sure.
for people.
Yeah, yeah.
But
But
anyway, that was great fun. But yes, it did have a Hammer feel. It did definitely have a Hammer feel. Just to wind up about Fanatic, by the way,
sure.
I think one of the very interesting features of it is that the men in it are all either peripheral or impotent in some, not literally impotent, but impotent in
Sure.
some way. Having said that, Peter Vaughan is always wonderful value as the typical shifty character who was played, and Maurice Kaufman as the fiance. But essentially, it's almost like a three-hander, isn't it, between the three women? Eutha Joyce, who's marvelous as the housekeeper, and Mrs. Trefoil, and well, yes, and Tallulah Bankhead and Stefanie Powers. So, but the real meat of the film is between those three characters. And given that we are talking hag horror, I think the fact that Fanatic has such a female focus is really very appropriate. And again, one of the most interesting things about it. And because Hammer films were almost always, almost exclusively well acted, that you're going to see. You're watching some really good actors there, including, by the way, Tallulah Bankhead, who abandoned all vanity, and which is kind of a prerequisite of this subgenre, and brought that incredible deep voice, steeped in alcohol and cigarettes and all sorts of other things, discussing the fact that it was Hammer's first psychological thriller in color. Of course, the color is actually very important thematically because there are one or two features of this film they couldn't have done in black and white. And my favorite is the fact that Mrs. Trefoil has a horror of the color red. Whether it's a sweater or whatever it may be. And my favorite moment is when she actually stumbles across the fiance's little car, and she sees that it's blood red, and she sort of she's horrified by it. And of course, there's a wonderful twist at the end when just before she dies, she pulls down one of the red drapes in her boudoir and it falls across her shoulder, so she looks rather like a Roman emperor or something. Suddenly, she herself is robed in the appalling, atrocious, decadent color that she abominates so much, red. I particularly like that touch. I'd also give a little recommendation for a film that is extremely similar to Fanatic. So similar that I think the novel it was based on, which was written by Naomi Hintzer, I wonder if Naomi Hintzer was actually remembering Fanatic, or Die Die My Darling, as she would have called it. But there's a film made by Lamont Johnson in 1972 called You'll Like My Mother. Now, the very title is kind of reminiscent of the action of Fanatic in a way, isn't it? You'll Like My Mother. And that's got Patty Duke in it and Rosemary Murphy. And in that one, the former fiance who comes to meet the mother, there's an extra twist in that she's pregnant,
Hmm.
and she too is, well, it follows, doesn't it? She gets imprisoned, by the. And so good. You Like My Mother is beautiful snow-covered landscapes, and again, a young ingenue in terrible dire peril from a mad older woman. It's one of those stories that never dies. But You Like My Mother, I think, if you wanted to have a little double bill one day, Fanatic and You'll Like My Mother would go together quite well.
All right, I'll definitely have to check that one out.
Yeah,
Well, Jonathan, thank you so much for your time. It truly is a pleasure getting to talk with you and listen.
yeah, no, it's always a pleasure, always a pleasure.
Yeah. All right. Well, if you're in the audience, I hope you enjoyed the film. If you have access to BritBox, please go check out Lot number 249. It's a lot of fun, and Jonathan steals the show, I would say.
Well, you're exaggerating.
Yeah,
The Mummy, possibly, but
the
yeah.
Mummy does. But you're the Michael Ripper of Lot number 249.
And that's what Mark Gatiss said to me. But I
Really?
decided, because I'm not a little man like Michael Ripper was, I decided that I was going to be more Nigel Green. You remember
There you go.
Nigel Green in Zulu
The
as the color
Zulu, yeah.
sergeant in Zulu? That's what was loosely speaking. That was what was at the back of my mind. It's lovely to talk to you. Another time. Till
Another
next time.
time. Next time. And if you're in the audience, I hope you have a safe trip home. Once again, my name is Ryan Bijan. We'll see you next time.